بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين لا سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على خلق أجمعين. واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني بزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In these past few nights that have passed by us very quickly, we have been talking about this khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali in particular, about this path that we are all undertaking throughout our lives, this path of fully realizing our place in this world, in Allah's creation, and our relationship with Allah. Until we got to this point where we realize that all of those actions that we do, all of those allies and those people that we surround ourselves with, all of them, ultimately, we come to this realization that none of those are enough, whether it is because of our intentions, because of the weakness of our bodies and ourselves, or whatever other reason. We realize that our only support and our only place of stability and source of stability is Allah. Now this, sometimes we might think, is a sign of failure, that we have failed ourselves or those around us have failed us. But in fact, this very realization that we don't have anything other than Allah and we depend fully on Him is one part and one stage in that process, and it's actually a sign of success. Ultimately, the khutbah of Imam Ali is trying to realize our place in Allah's creation, realize our full and utter dependence on Allah. And so realizing then that our actions, our intentions, and those around us are not enough to take us along this path, that is a sign of success. But once we turn to Allah, once we beseech Allah and ask Allah to help us, Allah as well doesn't leave us to our own devices. Allah doesn't leave us on our own. He as well sends certain means by which we can continue our path. And of course, the ultimate means and that ultimate source and that ultimate role model that Allah has presented for us, that source of guidance is His very Prophet, Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He says in his book that he is al-uswatul hasana, that ultimate role model that each and every one of us must take in our lives. Now, when we think about a function, the function of a role model, sometimes we think of it, a person, as that person doing a set of actions that we must emulate. So for example, the Prophet of Islam, he would pray in a particular way, and we should pray in that way. Or, as I mentioned last night, the Prophet was أَخَفُّ النَّاسِ صَلَاةً بِتَمَامٍ. When he would gather the Muslims in congregation, he would have an eye towards those who were weakest in that congregation. And he would adjust his prayer. And he would maybe shorten his prayers so that he doesn't leave people behind. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be weak in terms of body, but it could be weak in terms of iman. Sometimes having an extended prayer doesn't just tire us in terms of our physical body, but it might also tire us kind of mentally. We try to extend our prayer, or we try to follow someone, and it just is too long for us to bear, whether it's because we are young or because we're old. And so the Prophet had those weakest amongst his congregation in mind whenever he would pray. Now, one way we can think of the function of a role model is in terms of emulating our actions and changing and imitating that role model. But another way of looking at a role model in a deeper sense is that a role model sets the very potential for us. He broadens our horizons and shows us what does it mean to truly be a human being. What are those potentials that we have within us that we must actualize? What is that peak of virtue and justice and iman that we can reach as human beings? And so the Prophet sets that example for us. Not only does he set certain actions, but he broadens our horizons in understanding who we can be and what is our potential and our possibility. And he brings the Quran to outline some of that potential. And so after the Prophet, we can look to the Quran. But of course, the Quran is also not sufficient. The Quran can't function as a role model for us. The Quran itself points to certain individuals time and time again. Whenever the Quran gives us a virtue, it says do these things or follow this path, it cites certain people. It talks about certain individuals who have fulfilled that potential. Particularly in our society, a lot of times whenever we think about a role model or a person who maybe in some community or other is set up as an exemplar or as a very good and pious human being, sometimes we're skeptical. Well, maybe this person has some ulterior motives. Maybe he says some things in public, but then he does something else. We become skeptical and we become almost trying to protect ourselves from being deceived. But the function of a role model is to not only show us the potential, but to give us that hope that we can as well achieve that. We can as well actualize our potential. And so the Quran doesn't just set some certain standards for us, but it cites certain people that we can follow in actualizing those virtues. And it sets certain values that we should also value ourselves. We talked about what are those things that Muslims, whether in this society or in others, Muslims throughout history, what are those things that Muslims value? And then we compare that to what are the things that the Quran value. When we look in this surah, Surah Al-Asr, we see that for a human being to truly reach his potential, it gives certain virtues. It gives us certain characteristics for those who are not at a loss. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal asr, by time. Sometimes we define this in terms of asr, like asr prayers, but Mufassirun say that wal asr also refers to time, this lifetime that we spend in this world. And not just us, but all of human beings, all of this creation, this time that we cannot escape. Innal insana lafi khusr. Indeed, humankind, al-insan, not just individuals, but all human beings are at a loss. Illa alladhina. It doesn't say illa al-iman, for example. It doesn't give us some unreachable standard. It says, except for those people. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Except for those people who believe and who bring those beliefs into action. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And who enjoin each other in terms of the truth and enjoin each other in terms of patience. When we look in Islamic history, after the Prophet's death, we said that the Prophet is our very first role model, and there's no sort of controversy about this. When we think about that person who valued above all other things his iman, his amal al-salih, his tawasaw bil-haq wa tawasaw bil-sabr. When we look in the fada'il of all of those people who surrounded themselves and learned at the feet of the Prophet, there is no one else who has the amount of fada'il in these terms, not in terms of his military prowess, although he had that. Not in terms of how wealthy he was, although he had that too. But in terms of iman, amal al-salih, tawasaw bil-haq, wa tawasaw bil-sabr, there is no one other than Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam. When we think about alteration of the Quran, sometimes we think that the Quran is altered in terms of the words of the Quran. We think about the previous revelations that God sent to his earth, to his creation. Sometimes we think that the words of the Quran were altered. But when we look in the Quran and the history of the Quran, there is no other book and no other revelation that has been preserved, and the history has been known so well. And not just that, but in terms of the recitation of the Quran. And so the Ahlul Bayt, and in particular, there's a hadith from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam where he says, that previous people, and this of course also applies to Muslims, when they would get the revelation, then sometimes they would preserve the very words, and yet they would cast away that revelation. It talks about this alteration and this changing of the revelation. وَكَانَ مِن نَبْذِهِمْ الْكِتَابِ. And part of their alteration of the revelation of God, of the book of God, is their casting away. And أَقَامُوا حُرُوفًا. They would keep the words, they would preserve the words. وَحَرَّفُوا حُدُودًا. And yet they would alter the meanings. They would alter that depth of the book. فَهُمْ يَرْوُونَهُ وَلَا يَرْعَوْنَهُ. And so they would recite it and recount the book. When we think about alteration, don't just think about maybe certain words are being changed. Well, what's the meaning of the Quran? What are those virtues and those values that the Quran is pointing to? And so when we look in the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, we see that Imam Ali takes pride in these four things. Let's look at the Iman of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, when someone asks him, Have you seen your Lord? He says, how could I worship someone who I haven't seen? How could I worship some being who I haven't felt and been connected to? And the person asks, well, how could you have seen your Lord? He says, I don't see my Lord by my eyes, these eyes of my body. God is not something physical to be seen. And in fact, if he were physical, that means that he would be limited. But I see him بحقائق الإيمان. رؤية القلب بحقائق الإيمان. I see him through that depth of belief and faith. And that's how we should see Allah. There's nothing that can be limited by our eyes. When Amir al-Mu'mineen calls to his Lord, there's a few different types of ways that we can interact and we can speak to God. One is called dua. We do dua regularly, and dua is a process in which we have a particular need. And then we ask someone, and we call someone, and we invoke someone to fulfill this need that we have. So we ask God to bring peace and security to all Muslims throughout the world. In Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Syria, and wherever else there are mu'mineen or Muslimin in crisis. But then there's a different type of communication. We speak with Allah in terms of munajat. So look at the munajat of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Munajat is not now calling on God to fulfill my need. Munajat is a way for me to speak to someone I love. How do we speak to our beloved? Munajat is that communication. It's that speech. It's a speech of love, of mahabba, of ishq. Imam Ali, he calls to Allah, he says, Mawlaya ya Mawlaya. Anta al-Mawla wa ana al-Abd. Wa hal yarhamu al-Abda illa al-Mawla. Oh, my master, oh, my Lord, you are the ultimate Lord, and I am your lowly servant. And is there anyone who can help his servant except for his Lord? Imam Ali has this connection to Allah through the depths of his iman, through the depths of his heart. When we think about the amal of Amir al-Mu'mineen, what he takes pride in this khutbah al-Qasi'ah, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali outlines some of those actions. And he doesn't outline them just about things that happened in the past, but in terms of those values and those virtues that he takes pride in. He says, أَنَا وَضَعْتُ فِي الصِّغَرِ بِكَلَاكِلِ الْعَرَبِ. When I was young, I would fight the greatest chiefs of the Arabs, those heroes of the Arabs. I was the one who would fight them. When we look in Islamic history during the time of the Prophet, there was no one else who was at the head of all of the battles. And if he were not at the battle, then he was representing the Prophet in Medina. He was the hero of every battle. And there is no other companion which we can cite. Time and time again. In fact, Sharif al-Radhi, in the introduction to Nahj al-Balagha, when he talks about the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, at one time he says that these words almost seem like it's coming from someone who has secluded himself from the world and has just spent his time in worship of God. But we know that Amir al-Mu'mineen, at one time, he was worshiping God with the depth of his heart, and at another, he was at the head of each battle. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. I'll end with just one more word, and that is with the sabr of Amir al-Mu'mineen. For 25 years, imagine the message of the Prophet is being diverted from that path. Imagine that all of those values, all of those virtues that the Prophet tried to instill in society, imagine you are sitting there and you are facing all of that misguidance. And you know how to guide the Ummah. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen, in the second khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, he talks about this. He says, it was as though there was a thorn in my eye and there was a constriction in my throat. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't see what was happening to the Ummah and the inheritance of the Prophet. All of that guidance was being put to waste. And yet he had to bear. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And this brings us to Karbala. Tomorrow is Ashura. And in fact, they say that on the day of Tasu'ah, the battle was supposed to begin. The enemy soldiers had surrounded the camp to begin the war on this day, on Tasu'ah. And yet it is said that Imam Hussein asked his companions to go and ask for one more day so that we can call to our Lord. We can spend this night in worship. It said that the enemy soldiers had surrounded the camp and they had come closer and closer. Brothers and sisters, it is just one more day left until the tragedy of Karbala is going to take place. It is said that on that night, before Ashura, on the eve of Ashura, Imam Hussein gathered all of his companions in his tent. تَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Imam Hussein said, all of my companions, you have been very faithful and loyal to me, but now I have released you from your allegiance. You can go. You are free to go. And it is on a night like this that each one of his companions stand up and think about a person reaching their ultimate potential. We only need to cite each and one of those companions of Imam Hussein. They call out to Imam Hussein, "Oh Imam, if we needed to give our lives, and if we wanted, and if we had the ability to give our lives 70 times over, and be sacrificed at your feet 70 times again, then, oh Imam, we would bear that. Oh Imam, how could we leave you when your grandfather is looking? Where do we go other than your camp, other than your side?" When you think about the patience of the Ahlul Bayt, the Prophet of Islam himself had told Imam Hussein. It is said that when Imam Hussein was born, the Prophet took Imam Hussein in his arms, and it is said that he would cry and he would kiss the body of Imam Hussein. And when they would ask him, "Why do you kiss the throat of Imam Hussein? Why do you kiss the throat of your infant grandson?" He says, I kiss the place where the swords are going to cut off. Imam Hussein knew his own fate. And on this night, he told the fate of each and every one of his companions. He told Zuhair, "You will be killed in this way." He told Habib, "This is how you will meet your end." And maybe he told Ali al-Akbar, "You will be cut to pieces in front of my eyes." And Abbas, "You will try to reach the water, but you won't make it back." But there's one moment in this night that really is difficult to pronounce. There's one moment that Imam Hussein is reciting certain words to himself. And it is said that Imam Sajjad hears these words and he realizes what is going to happen on the next day. But he tries to contain his grief. But when Lady Zainab hears those very words, it is said that Lady Zainab, she starts crying out loud, "Oh Hussein, what are you saying? What will happen tomorrow? Are we not going to? What are these people going to do to you? Oh, Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, you knew what will happen to Hussein, but you weren't there to witness." And so Lady Zainab, on the day of Ashura, when the day comes, and Imam Hussein on top of his horse, she sees from that hilltop, she witnesses all that will take place. She sees the enemy soldiers. When Imam Hussein falls to the ground, she sees the enemy soldiers circling around his body. She sees this enemy soldiers start to circle around the body of Imam Hussein. And she starts to call out, "Oh, Amar ibn Sa'd, أيقتل الحسين وأنت تنظر إليه." Do you see Imam Hussein being killed? And you just look out and you just stare. And so she runs towards the body of Imam Hussein. But not before Shem has come to that body. Is there no mercy that these people can show? His body is on the ground, the grandson of the Prophet. And they don't let this body in prostration have any peace. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. Please have a seat and stay seated for the presentation. Sallallahu.
اللهم كن حجته من الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة هي المحافظة والقائد المناصرة ودليلا معينا حتى تسكن في الفتاة وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمة الشريعة.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. History has always been told by men. It had always been his story both now and even then. Except when a woman held the pen to write, a woman in black with all her right. For they wished to silence her ink and her pen, but even her shadow could conquer these cowardly men. As her verses burst the humming of the birds, for even the kings would be overcome by her words. But like the sun she rose, as she was raised a flower, delicate but possessing all this world's power. Though they wished to see a woman nothing but broken, instead found her courage outspoken. She was an ocean in which oppression would drown, while possessing pearls that freedom would crown. And though they threw the world's weight on her shoulders, they undermined the strength of the upholder. Just like other women, they hoped for her to be extinct, her message to vanish before she even blinked. To weaken this woman to her knees and be seized by the martyr's deathly breeze. Many have lost loved ones, or even two or one, but she witnessed the death of every man she knew. Drowned by the sight of severed bodies drained dry, both brothers butchered with spears even in the eye. For she saw bodies shattered and splattered, every limb and organ that was scattered, to silence the tongues in which the Lord was praised, but they didn't realize it was on suffering that she was raised. Though she rose on those sounds of death, and she gave birth to a spirit in her breath, and though she could not rewind the tapes of times, she versed those tapes, painting each crime, as those scenes the world has already seen. But this time the history books would not be wiped clean, as what would have been tainted truth, the propaganda lies, now lies the eyes of Zainab and those children's cries. Salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Ya Hussein, 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 Ya Hussein.
Brothers, let's form two rows on each side, inshallah, so we can properly do that without it. Ya Hussein.
Zainab is crying, Allah, Zainab. Zainab is calling out, oh, Zainab. Zainab, wa Khalifa, wa Shahida, wa Husayna, wa Ghariba, wa Shahida. Please don't leave me alone, oh brother. How will I live without you, oh brother? Wa Husayna, wa Ghariba, wa Shahida, wa Husayna, wa Ghariba, wa Shahida. What will happen to our beloved orphans? How will I care for them and have patience when the fire will light in your hands? What will I وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا. How will I handle the kids who will frown? How will I handle the kids who will frown? How will I tell them to calm down? How will I tell them to calm down? وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا. Farewell, farewell, my life. Patience, patience on this difficult night. وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا وحسينا وغريبا وشهيدا. يا حسين
Zuljanat minal haywan, khali wa wayla. Zuljanat minal haywan, khali wa wayla. Ewa Hussaina, ewa Garib, ewa Shaheed, ewa Mazloom, Hussaina. Zuljanat minal शोरू हुआ लो खाली आया, शोरू हुआ लो खाली आया, चोर के ज़ैनब काम आ जाया, आगे कभी है घूमे नहाया, ज़ैनब ने दुखराया सुनाया, जुगना खाली बावेला एवा गरीब एवा शहीद एवा मजलूम हुसैना जुलजना मिनल खून में चल रहे वार को देखा, खून में चल रहे वार को देखा, रोही तरफ करबानी सकीना, बोली कहाँ है मेरे बाबा, छीन लिया क्यों मेरे सहारा, जुलजना काली एवा हुसैना एवा गरीब एवा शहीद एवा मजलूम हुसैना जुलजना मिनल मैं तेरे सदके मैं तेरे वारी, मैं तेरे सदके मैं तेरे वारी, तू मेरे बाबा की है सवारी, तेरे बदन से खून है जारी, जख्म लगे हैं जिस्म पे तारी, काली बावेला एवा गरीब एवा शहीद एवा मजलूम हुसैना जुलजना बात न मानी तूने मेरी, बात न मानी तूने मेरी, रोही बहुत कदमों से लिपटी, बोली कहाँ है मेरे बाबा, छीन लिया क्यों मेरा सहारा, एवा गरीब एवा शहीद एवा मजलूम जुलजना मिनल छोड़ दिया क्यों रन में अकेला छोड़ दिया क्यों रन में अकेला चुगमों से था मेरे बाबा किसने उठाया लाशा पे लाशा तन्हा क्यों मक्तल से आया दुगना खाली एवा गरीब एवा शहीद एवा मजलूम सुजना عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم دار جان تشنه در راه جانان دار جان تشنه در راه جانان کرده پاینده را خان قربان تا که باشد مرا در بدن جان تا که باشد مرا در بدن جان همچو من در نوای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم تو به او گشت شارای دینم او به او گشت شارای دینم حق بود چو بسد یقینم کی شود کربلایش ببینم کی شود کربلایش ببینم من که نوها سرای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم کی شود راه کویش به پایم کی شود راه کویش به پایم کی شود گنبدش را ببوسم مرقدش را ببوسم بگویم مرقدش را ببوسم بگویم من بیعتای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم کشته شد در راه دین و ایمان کشته شد در راه دین و ایمان از فداکاریش زنده قرآن از غمش تا دمی جان از غمش تا دمی جان روز و شب بر عزای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم کرده بر نیز قرآن تلاوت کرده بر نیز قرآن تلاوت تا کنه چون قیام را هدایت او شده جان فدای بحر امت او شده جان فدای بحر امت من به غم مبتلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم من گدای حسینم عاشقی کربلای حسینم جان چو خواهد جدا کردنستم جان چو خواهد جدا کردنستم در دم آخر و وقت مردن چون زبان باز ماند ز گفتن چون زبان باز ماند ز گفتن من به یاد لقاء حسینم من گدای حسینم आशिक़े करबला ये हुसैना ये हुसैना आशिक़े करबला ये हुसैना या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन Mawla Hakim Ya Hasan Ya Hussein Mawla Hakim Ya Hasan Ya Hussein Ya Hussein Ya Hussein वो आबिदे बीमार था वो आबिदे बीमार था चलने से जो लाचार था और शाम का बाजार था और शाम का बाजार था और मुस्तफा की बेटियां मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन शबीर की वो लाडली शबीर की वो लाडली सीने पे जो शहके पली जिसकी अबा बन में जली जिसकी अबा बन में जली मुंह पर तमाचों के निशान मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन प्यासे गले पंचर चले प्यासे गले पंचर चले चादर छिनी पैने जले आकाश के परचम तले आकाश के परचम तले रो कर कहीं ये बीबियां मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन रो कर कहे कासिम की माँ रो कर कहे कासिम की माँ मारा गया कासिम जहाँ ऐलान में ढूंढूं कहाँ ऐलान में ढूंढूं कहाँ मेरी तेरी सेवा तेरा मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन वो अकबरे बेशीर था वो अकबरे बेशीर था और उर्मला का तीर था प्यासा गला क्यों कचदा प्यासा गला क्यों कचदा नरसी जमीन और आसमां मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन वो बाबा पास था वो बाबा पास था दुखियों की जो एक रास था पानी लिया पर ना पिया पानी लिया पर ना पिया प्यासी रही शहजादियां मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला हाकिम या हसन या हुसैन
गरीबा छा गई शाम गरीबा छा गई आबिद को गैरत खा गई पहले पे ज़ैनब आ गई पहले पे ज़ैनब आ गई अब्बास और अकबर कहाँ मौला इमाम या हसन या हुसैन मौला इमाम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन मौला इमाम या हसन या हुसैन मौला इमाम या हसन या हुसैन या हुसैन شب عاشورای حسین است شب عاشورای حسین است دل من شیدای حسین است دل من شیدای حسین است هستی من وقف نفسهای حسین است هستی من وقف نفسهای حسین است دل من مجنونه روحی سوزان است دل من مجنونه روحی سوزان است امشبی با شهدی در حرمش بماند امشبی با شهدی در حرمش بماند سیدی یا مظلوم یا ابا عبدالله 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 ای نوا ایران ابوالفضل ای نوا ایران ابوالفضل بنده چشمان ابوالفضل بنده چشمان ابوالفضل لشکر ارباب به فرمان ابوالفضل لشکر ارباب به فرمان ابوالفضل گل لیلا گرمه خواندن قرآن است گل لیلا گرمه خواندن قرآن است امشبی یا شهدی در حرمش بماند امشبی یا شهدی در حرمش بماند سیدی یا مظلوم یا ابا عبدالله 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 ای نگاهت قرار زینب ای نگاهت قرار زینب میروی از کنار زینب میروی از کنار زینب مگیر از من سایت سالار زینب مگیر از من سایت سالار زینب روزی چشمانم بعد تو باران است روزی چشمانم بعد تو باران است امشبی یا شهدی در حرمش بماند امشبی یا شهدی در حرمش بماند سیدی یا مظلوم یا ابا عبدالله 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 حسن من عشق چشامه کفنم پیر سیامه به همه میگم تو همشم بدونی حسین آقامه حسن من عشق چشامه کفنم پیر سیامه به همه میگم تو همشم بدونی حسین آقامه یا حسین عزیز زهرا 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 یا حسین عزیز
عمری تو دنیا که فقط مست تو بودم جون یا حسین زهرا تو لحد پیش سرودم فکر تلقین توی قبرم نام شاه عالمیه فکر تلقین توی قبرم نام شاه عالمیه صدر و کافورم ایشالله تربت قبر حسینه غسل من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرن سیامه به همه میگم تو محشر بدونید حسین آقامه یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا وصیت کردم رو بقرم روزه زینب بخونم وصیت کردم رو بقرم روزه زینب بخونم تا شاید آقام بیاد و تا سهر پیشم بمونم وقتی که مکی رو موندم رو به روی من میشینم عکس شش گوش زنی رو به روی سینم میبینم سینم کبوده وحشت رو ازم میگیرم جای پرسشای قبرم بوسه از سینم میگیرم غسل من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرن سیامه به همه میگن تو محشر بدونی حسین آقامه یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا امشبی روشن دین در حرمش مهمانند امشبی روشن دین در حرمش مهمانند مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح کنون امشبی روشن دین در حرمش مهمانند امشبی روشن دین در حرمش مهمانند مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح کنون اصل فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم اصل فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح امشبی را شهدی در حرمش مهمانم امشبی را شهدی در حرمش مهمانم مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح کنون صبح فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم صبح فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح کنون امشبی را شهدی در حرمش مهمانم امشبی را شهدی در حرمش مهمانم مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح کنون اصل فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم اصل فردا بدنش زیر سم اسبانم مکنه صبح کنون مکنه صبح یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا منزه یا عبدالله یا منزه یا عبدالله یا منم حیدر یا عبدالله یا منم حیدر یا عبدالله که متنها یا عبدالله در دل البا یا عبدالله در دل صحرا یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله کربلا یا عبدالله شفا بده یا عبدالله مرزای ما یا عبدالله عوانم یا عبدالله حاجات ما یا عبدالله یارینم یا عبدالله بر ما یا عبدالله در نشام گیر سر هر لحظه بوی کربلا در دلم ترسم بماند آرزوی کربلا تشنه نام فراتم بیاید ماند تو یا ابا الهی بابا الهی بابا الهی بابا الهی الهی بسكينه الهی بسكينه يا زينب يا زينب يا زينب يا این حسین کیست که عالم همه دیوانه این چه شمیست که جان همه پروانه یا سید الممنون یا سید الغنی یا سید الابشار آی 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 مثل امشبی هلال ابن نافع میگه نیمه آی شب دیدم سیاهی پشت خیمه ها در حرکته هی میشینه بلند میشه نگران شدم نزدیکتر شدم دیدم ابا عبدالله آهسته پشت سر آقا بودم نکنه کسی جسارتی کنه آقا متوجه حضور من شد فرمود هلال اینجا چه میکنی؟ از کردم آقا جان نگران شما این وقت شب تو این بیابون چه میکنی؟ ابی عبدالله فرمود هلال دارم این خارای بیابان جمع میکنم فردا شب بچه هم تو این بیابون آواره میشن اسمك عظيم الأعظم دم المظلوم بكربلاء يا الله 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 يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك وعلى محبة الحسين في الدنيا والآخرة واكفنا يا باقي الرجاء ويا كافر المهمات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك غافر الذنب والخطيئات إنك على كل شيء غني. Lord, reciting the ayah of Al-Najib, it says Salam. It's the night of Ashura. Our Imam of time, Imam Mahdi, is very sad tonight. It's the night that Sayyid Fatima is very upset. Imagine yourself in Bain al-Haramain, facing the dome of Abu Abdullah. Let's put our hands on our chest. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي أملأت فنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر الأمر مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم من يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 من يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. For all مرحومين المرحومات على الخصوص قادر رزق أبي محمد رحم الله من يقرأ الفاتحة مع الصلوات.